It's that combination of skills rather than the hyper specialization in any one, saying just getting bigger, that allowed me to sort of, I guess, to stand out in a noisy industry. Generalism is the outcome, and minimalism is part of the process. The more you kind of play by the rules and play in a structured way for many years, the better you're going to be at improvising.
Don't ask a writer where his ideas come from.
You better know the rules before you start to bend the rules, and especially before you break the rules. Good writing is imitation.
And welcome back. Hello, Pat. How are you, man?
Good, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. It's great to connect again. So it's been a while. I think it was last summer, the last time we chatted first on the other podcast, right?
No way. Was it really that long?
Right.
No, you're right. Yeah. No, it has been that long. What a shame. Yeah. What a shame.
Well, it's and we're here now, and it feels like we just connect. That's funny, right? It's like, especially in these times with the world, it's like, it feels like everything is a million years ago and yesterday at the same time.
Yeah. Cause I remember we first spoke just briefly on the phone, and yeah, you're right. Cause I was actually in Michigan. That would have been, wow. Yeah, that makes me sad that much time has passed. Actually, it's depressing. Exactly, but it's good to be back, and it's gonna be nothing but optimism from here on out.
That's it, exactly. Yeah, it's just glass completely full from here on out. So yeah, well, again, thank you very much for taking the time. I appreciate it. As I said last time on the podcast, you were one of the first people I followed when I got into this business with Chronicles of Strength, and your writing work of what you were doing with early onset kind of RKC and kettlebell stuff. And the message that you had really about generalism, I think, is so interesting because, I think that term is something I'd love to chat with you about, but you kind of said it in a way of kind of be good at a bunch of stuff, not just like try and be great at one thing, which I think is something that a lot of people get, kind of go down that path and almost like put their blinders on, when in reality, if you can apply a minimalist approach or a generalist approach to everything that you do, you're going to be a lot more well-rounded. You can be a lot more successful in many different things. And that's what I just found from your writing and the authenticity of what you do with the podcast and stuff. So again, just kind of my fanship to you, I'd say that your stuff is phenomenal, man. I appreciate it.
Well, I blush, and it's funny because the whole, I guess, sort of theme of generalism, I think it more or less always ran throughout most of my writing and most of my work, certainly in the fitness area, but I didn't really make it explicit until before my little Greene book came out, How to Be Better at Almost Everything. And it was made explicit almost because of an insult, which is pretty funny. I didn't take it as an insult, but somebody emailed me one time and they were kind of asking for business advice, if I remember the context right. And they said, Pat, you seem to have done all right for yourself as an entrepreneur in the fitness space, but you're not like the biggest, strongest dude around, right? So how did you do it, right? And like, look, I have no delusions, right? I'm as Irish as they come, right? Any strength that I've gained is like any musical ability I've gained. It was gained the hard way over a long time, right? Never won any bodybuilding competitions, never will, like no delusions, right? I think I've done some cool stuff, right? But it's a good point, right? I'm not a hyper specialist. So I really thought about that, and like, not like I'm offended, like, no, this is a good question. And really, this was when it kind of became explicit to me, is that what I've been able to do was just bring stuff to the fitness market from my background skill set, right? So I've got academic backgrounds in philosophy and economics. I've been a writer for a very long time. I've put my ugly mug on camera for a long time and practiced communicating. And yeah, it just became more and more obvious to me that I was able to, kind of carve out a space for myself in a very noisy industry, not because I was biggest, strongest, fastest, I was just different. I was unique. I was able to communicate in a way. I knew about marketing and I knew about kind of exploring ideas. And it was that combination of skills rather than the hyper specialization in any one, saying just getting bigger, that allowed me to sort of, I guess, to stand out in a noisy industry. And that's when I decided, okay, I think there's something there. Maybe it's an article, but why not just do a book? Because everyone just makes a book out of something that really should be an article these days. And that was my
right. It's a very long article from there, right?
Very long article, right? And I hate that too. I hate getting a book like this book's an article. You could have done this book in like 3 pages. I'm probably guilty of that myself. Yeah.
Looking back on that, was that kind of someone reaching out, you think, for like a quick fix type thing of just like, oh, I need a little bit of information. Let me reach out to this guy because he seems like he might have the epiphany answer that I'm looking for?
That's a really good question. I actually, my memory on this is so fleeting. I couldn't even remember what I said to that person at the moment, or even who that person was. I just remember looking back. That's what kind of set me off and trying to make explicit this sort of undergirding philosophy of mine that I think was always operative. I just hadn't really like crystallized it, if that makes sense. So yeah, I just don't remember.
Well, it's funny because sometimes you like a backhanded compliment like that, right? Like it could very easily just be like, oh, whoever, whatever this guy. It's like, yeah, I'm not the biggest, strongest. I'm better, stronger than you. You can go a lot of different routes, but you took it in a way of like, oh, maybe this is actually a skill set that I can really provide, to the world.
Yeah. So yeah, certainly. I mean, people have, as I'm sure you get those emails too, there are a number of people who kind of want that quick fix, right? And those just don't exist. I'm very clear about that in my book, is even though I'm not advocating for a hyper specialization, and I am advocating for a sort of minimalism. Let's get clear on what minimalism is. Minimalism is just trying to be maximally effective and efficient. Effective meaning let's figure out what the right things are and do those, and then efficient, let's try and do those right things right in an efficient way, right? So for exercise, it's easy to illustrate this. You want to build upper body strength muscle. Okay, running is probably not the right thing to do. Great exercise, but for that goal, not that effective, right? It's not what's going to really kind of push you along in the direction you want to go. Even if you're super efficient at running, even if your technique is great and you've got a very efficient running program, it's just not effective, right? Conversely, you might have good exercise selection and stuff to develop upper body strength, pull-ups and presses and stuff, but you might be inefficient in your technique and your programming and stuff like that. So the way I think about minimalism is it's almost trivial, right? It's like, when would you ever not want to be effective and efficient? Like, when would you ever just want to waste your time, is kind of the way I'm advocating it. So in that sense, you might worry that I'm not saying anything interesting, but I think it's a reminder, because a lot of us aren't coming from that perspective, or at least we don't focus in on what we're doing enough to ask, is this really effective? And am I doing it efficiently? So that's the role I think minimalism is supposed to provide. But that does not mean just doing very few things or doing very little. In fact, I think for most of the goals that are really worth pursuing, and especially if you want to be like an expert generalist, you got a ton of work to do, right? You still have a ton of work to do. It's just how you're going to prioritize and divvy up your efforts.
There was a great analogy that Brett Jones gave me a long time ago. He did the, I think, first ever level 2 FMS workshop at the place that I worked at here in upstate New York. And it was a small one. It was only the team that I had at my gym, which was maybe about 9 or 10 people, and then like 3 or 4 other people there. And one of the guys I remember was a martial arts master. I think it was Taekwondo. It might've been something else, but he was talking about this like in this minimalist approach. And he said, well, you're a master in martial arts. It's like, how many different moves do you know to knock somebody out? It's like, well, you know a lot. How many do you use when you're in a fight? It's like, well, the first one that works. So it's kind of like, it's if you know all these different skills, that's great. You might not always need to use them all the time, but it's just finding that first one that works and really gives the most bang for your buck when it's needed. And I thought that was kind of an interesting analogy for minimalism, where it's like, it doesn't mean you have to only find these exercises and only do these drills. You can do other ones, but be aware of what are the ones that are going to give you the most bang for your buck at that time that you need them.
Yeah, Taekwondo is really interesting because that's my primary martial arts background. And I actually didn't get I was doing Taekwondo for a considerable number of years before I even got my black belt. And the reason was I was so interested in the competing side of Taekwondo, which is very different, or at least it's different enough from the formal side of Taekwondo. And the reason being is like what you use in Taekwondo competitions generally are just some like few basic moves to tag your opponent. But then what you need to kind of test in Taekwondo are all the fancy kicks that you would never use, right? In a fight or a sparring match. So I mostly just ignored that stuff because it wasn't relevant to what I wanted to do, which was be a good Taekwondo competitor. Then I graduated college, and the kind of competitive Taekwondo aspect kind of fell away. In case anybody didn't notice, I was never in the Olympics. But I still loved the martial art. And that's when I decided, now I do want to do the more flowery stuff, the more extravagant, kind of the the art, the movement art of the martial art rather than just the fighting side. And then it made sense. So now I'm going to start learning all the fancy kicks and stuff like that, because now my goal was actually to, I guess, yeah, we'll get black belt, which I eventually did, not just compete anymore. But while I was competing, I really restricted myself just to the things that I needed that made sense for that goal. Right.
Right.
That makes sense.
Huh. Okay. So it's like when you're in competition, it's like, okay, like the goal there is much different than just practicing and mastery. It's like, okay, now there's an objective where I need to win, I need to score points. So maybe you kind of, it's almost like shrinking the playbook down a bit of like, these are the things that I know are going to work the best and really get that. Then when you can open it up a little bit more, then work on these different skills, maybe one comes that is perfect for you down that line, but you kind of put yourself in a different environment where now you can explore almost like a little bit more of a creativity rather than just going in and just working it, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So I mean, like there's probably a number of people who are a lot smarter and better than me at Taekwondo that might disagree, but in competition, I mean, you're doing really a lot of roundhouse kicks and basic stuff, and really trying to learn the nuances of the game and how to tag, how to move and control distance and stuff like that. It's like a human chess match, right? Whereas in the broader practice of Taekwondo, especially if you're going to be testing, you're learning all sorts of forms and different movement patterns, and sometimes very complex movement patterns and very complex technical, sometimes high flying kicks, right? That take a lot of time and energy to learn, but don't translate to the competitive stuff, right? So for me, as somebody who's like very time crunched, especially in college, competing and teaching and doing all those other things, right? I was like, okay, I'm going to bracket that stuff off that isn't like immediately or obviously relevant to the thing that I care about, which is just trying to win matches, until it is relevant to me, when I don't care as much about winning matches. And I do want to explore more of what you said, the creative side, more of the art versus the competitive side of Taekwondo.
Yeah. It's interesting in the fitness world of that, because I'm a minimalist at heart too. I think a lot of people listening are probably, similar. If they're listening to my show or listening to your show, they'll probably understand this line. But do you think minimalism and generalism are the same thing, or do you think there's a big distinction between those two?
So I think the way I think about it, I think I say this in my book. It's been a long time since I've read my own book, so somebody might want to fact check my work. I say that sort of generalism is the outcome, and minimalism is part of the process, right? That's the way I think about it, right? So you want to be a generalist. You want to be somebody who's good to great, or at least fairly competent in a broad range of skills, and then stack those skills to form competitive and creative advantages. That's my general slogan, if you will, right? And I think, how we're going to get there is through a minimalist process, right? So minimalism relates to the process, generalism relates to the outcome. But you could certainly still want to be a hyper specialist and still want to be a minimalist about how you go about it. So I would say, no, I don't think that they're the same thing, but I do think that they're compatible when you think of them like that.
Yeah. How do you use this in like your daily work? I'm curious to find out a little bit about your like day to day on there. Like with your, is there a specific training program that you follow right now, for your day? Is there a specific goal that you're working towards?
Well, right now I'm actually going back to my white belt days, because I started doing jujitsu again. Okay. I say again because I always kind of did other martial arts as a supplement to Taekwondo, even though Taekwondo was always my primary focus. So for a number of years, way back, I did roll a fair amount. But this year, in fact, I'm training with Ryan Toshner. You know Toshner, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the Toshner brothers, right? So yeah,
okay.
So let me give Ryan a plug. He owns TNT down at Brookfield, and he's my coach. He's my coach.
Oh, no way.
In jiu-jitsu, yeah. So he's the one who's tuning me up. And
I love the Toshner boys. They're amazing.
Oh, and just savage.
Just savage. They're just like built from a different cloth. Yeah.
Yeah, especially Derek's the reason why I would never want to be a specialist, because I'm never going to beat Derek in the tactical strength challenge. Like it's just like there's no as long as he's in this, there's no reason for Pat Flynn to even bother, right? It's just like just an absolute monster.
Well, and when you see Derek in real life and you just see the dimensions of how he's built, of just like crazy long legs, short torso, it's like, okay, like when he's snatching, I'm like, that looks different than when I snatch from there. Yes. It's like, oh, he's got it completely down in his cadence. It's a different animal.
Yeah, it is. So anyways, long story short, because martial arts has kind of come back into the forefront for me, a lot of my kettlebell training is now, again, supplementary towards that. So still very generalist, minimalist. I have 2 to 3 kind of primary heavier sessions per week, with your typical, mobility work. And I like to always have at least one sort of variety conditioning type of day in there. But the more you roll, or the more you get your conditioning from the sport, the kind of more I pull back on the conditioning with the kettlebells, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so I try to, with the kettlebells, and I'm not just restricted to kettlebells. I do barbell and a lot of body weight stuff too. For me, it's okay. How can I supplement? How can I fill gaps? And if I'm already getting a ton of conditioning, as you will, rolling around, I don't feel the need to do as much conditioning work as I otherwise would.
Gotcha.
With kettlebells. So yeah.
Is it more of a set program that you follow, or does it kind of more of like an intuitive type approach that you do to your strength
These
training
days
right
it's
now?
fairly intuitive. If I have a pushing goal, say like, oh, I really want to break this plateau, right, in strength, then I'll structure it a bit more. But as I'm sure you know, right, once you kind of been in it and doing it for a while, we tend to just kind of go by feel, right? Which I think is legitimate after you've been doing it and in it for a while. I mean, think of like the parallel of music. The more you kind of play by the rules and play in a structured way for many years, the better you're going to be at improvising, right? You can't improvise right from the very beginning because you don't have the chops. But once you build the chops, then you can improvise, right? And this was something my music theory teacher always impressed upon me, and I think I carried it in fitness. She would always say, you better know the rules before you start to bend the rules, and especially before you break the rules, right? And
I love that.
Yeah, so that was that to me was always my approach to fitness. Okay, I'm going to learn the rules first, learn the basic principles, here to be very structured. But then, yeah, over time, as I felt like I had more confidence and command of them, you get a little bit more creative. You start to improvise a little bit more. So yeah, a lot of times now it's intuitive.
Do you think you get to that point of like, if you want to keep progressing, you have to tap into that little bit of creative space in your training besides just blindly following it? Like, I went through really the last year of pretty much intuitive the entire year, no set real goal that I was working towards. I just wanted to move every day. I wanted to play.
Yeah.
Working with Brett, I did a lot of his iron cardio and strength aerobics protocols that we were working with. So single rep complexes, and then getting into like, some muscle testing. I had Adam Glass and Frankie Ferris on. We talked a lot about biofeedback solution stuff. And that was super interesting. But now, like, going into, I'm training for like barbell cert. So I'm doing a lot of barbell work. And I kind of almost feel like I'm back to a beginner status. I haven't touched a barbell in years. So it's like, okay, now this is what I'm doing today, following more of a very structured plan down the line. But it's almost like all that intuitive stuff from last year, it still comes in. You can feel what feels good and what doesn't from there. But it's almost, I'm thinking like, if you get to a point where you have to start playing around more, that's really just like the next evolution in training if you've followed just a foundation or just a minimalist approach for so long.
I think that's right. I've certainly found myself in those situations. I mean, right now, I'm being, I guess, more creative with some of the body weight stuff. So I'm interested in like getting my handstands from just like okay, barely passable to like let's polish this up. Let's make this look actually good and impressive now. And again, I'm not following a terribly structured approach to it. I mean, I've got my general. The way I think about it is like you always want general guidelines. Like as long as you're within. Dan, John, and I talked about this the other day. Like you have bumpers up, right? As long as you kind of stay within the bumpers, you're probably going to be heading in the direction that you want. Maybe you're not being as efficient as you could be, which might be a little inconsistent with the minimalist approach. But for example, with a handstand session I did the other day, I had my normal kind of kettlebell stuff laid out. I was just doing some basic swing ladders and stuff like that, and I just did reverse handstand and handstand push-up ladders. So like 3-2-1, 3-2-1, 3-2-1, a number of sets of that. Not too structured, and a lot of it was by feel. So once I felt like, okay, I'm kind of tapped out at this point, maybe I could do another run, but I've got a lot of decent volume in. So I think that's kind of what you're talking about, this sort of intuitive sense that you really can't articulate or define, but it's one of those things like it once you got it type of thing going on, right? So if that's what you're talking about, then yes, I agree. There's this sort of I don't know, deeper type of knowledge that you gain just through the years of experience of doing this type of things that can give you reliable indicators of what direction to go, kind of even within any particular workout. I would say, like, again, it seems like improvising on the guitar for me. Like, the longer you've been doing it, like, you just kind of get better at making those in the moment prudent decisions of what passage you're going to play, or where you're going to go from where you are right now. And I would say, yeah, there definitely seems to be something like that.
Right.
When it comes to self-programming, right?
Yeah. It's been just a curious topic to explore with just creativity within program, because so many times, like, being a coach and, working with people, you've had those people who are like, okay, I want you to just tell me what to do. Just tell me what I need to do to get to X, Y, Z. And for the longest time, especially being a young coach for years, it's like, okay, like, I understand that. Like, you just don't have the knowledge base of coming in. You just need to know what to do. But then you still have those people who, no matter how great of a program or great of a plan is, it wasn't in there. And I think it's because there's no ownership on that part to it. So that's kind of just been a thought process in my head of, is the creative side of having to almost have that day where you need to trust your feel, you need to understand that. Is that really a gateway and a path to take full ownership of your program? Of getting it kind of comes back to, have you ever read the book by Robert Greene, Mastery? Great book. People are probably exhausted from me bringing up this book every time, but it really is interesting. He kind of lays out mastering something in 3 different phases. Like, you have your apprenticeship, then your creative active, and then mastery. And the apprenticeship is kind of get your reps in. If you haven't done this for forever, just follow a program, just learn the rules, as you just said, right? But then you get to the creative active, where you take the instruction from your mentor or your master, your maestro, wherever it is. And then you kind of have to apply your own piece to that. And that's the way to really get into mastery, because at that point, just blindly following another program might give you a little bit of progress, but it's not going to give you that complete fulfillment and that next step.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. It sounds right to me. Sounds like something I talk about in my book a little bit, about the process. And this something, again, I kind of pulled from music, but brought into other areas like fitness, of, first you isolate, then you integrate, then you improvise, right? So you have to isolate the kind of basic components you need for integration to be possible, right? So if I'm going to play, I don't know, Back in Black on AC/DC, like, all right, I need to figure out how to play an E chord, a D chord, and a G chord, at least, right? I better get those basic techniques down, right? That'll give you like 90% AC/DC songs.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I think you got Angus down.
Yeah. Right. So, but like, I can't integrate to Back in Black unless I get those basic components down. So I need to at least isolate those as much as possible. I would say only as far as possible until I can integrate. Like, I want to get to integration as quickly as possible, right? No use like learning every chord known to man. Like, I don't have to go and learn like an E flat 13 chord, right, to play AC/DC. No, just get the basic components, and then let's get on to integration. And then once you have that, we do want to try and start to be creative within that context. I would argue as quickly as possible, right? Because it helps you form just new connections. So I say, okay, once you can integrate, then do try and improvise at least some of the time, even early on. But you can't improvise, of course, like you said, until you at least have some of the basic chops. So I'm big on this process. In fact, this is kind of how I just practice guitar now, right? There's something I'm isolating, some technique that's important for something that's related to a goal. So this is minimalism informing. It is related to a goal, like a song I want to learn. In fact, I just sort of got recruited for a cover band right now. So I've got like a pretty major set list of crap I got to learn. This is all very fresh on my mind.
Nice.
But then, so like songs I'd never played before, like I'm a Man by Chicago and stuff like that. So I was playing that the other day.
Okay.
Then, which is a fun tune. But then always within that context, I always want to improvise, right? I want to flex the creative muscles, right? So I get the components down, integrate, make sure I'm nailing that tune. But then I want to own it, right? I want to master it and make it my own and improvise within that, in that context. And I think you can just do the same thing with fitness, right? There's basic components, exercises you have to get down. You do have to learn to integrate them in a program towards your goal. But then I think maybe what we're chasing after here is there does seem to also be something more than that, a creative element, an intuitive element, an element of improvisation. And that's what you should be aiming for, at least some of the time. And there's a lot of value in that. And not just value, but I think fun. I think it keeps things psychologically interesting as well. Mhm.
I think that's that piece you just brought, the fun of it and the enjoyment. I think it's one of those concepts that we just forget to talk about when we're going into goals, right? And you
Mhm.
kind of think of that as like, wow, I have a goal for my health to get better and stronger. I want to lean out, or I have a goal for my business where I want to generate more income and stuff. How fucking fun is that? Like, that sounds like the most fun in the world, but we never
Right.
think
Yeah.
of it in that point. And that's like, so like with your music, of like, kind of, you kind of start there. It's almost like a warm up, it seems, right? Of like
Mhm.
starting with, yeah, how to integrate it, and then playing a little bit of that improvisation that
Right.
probably taps into a little bit of the fun side of it. So you want to go back to the guitar and keep doing this, because if you kept just doing the same stuff over and over again,
It's a
yeah,
little
like,
stale, right? Like, look, I love playing Angus's licks, but after the 14 millionth time, I kind of want to see what I can do over the
mhm.
back of black rhythm. You know what I mean?
Yes, yeah. Do you take that approach to your ventures in business and stuff too? Because I know you've got a lot of things that you do. I mean, you've got Chronicles of Strength with your writing, you have the Pat Flynn Show, your podcast, and your coaching. So you're into a lot of different buckets throughout the day. Is this the approach that you kind of just take on, a general approach to goals in your life?
Yeah. So there's always the priority goal, whatever that is, right? And sometimes it's a business goal. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it might be like right now. I have two books I'm working on. So those have assumed something of a priority. Fortunately, though, my prior goals I had in business has sort of allowed me to automate a lot of it, right? So like the business can provide the sort of economic stability, so I can pursue other things that not only do not contribute to my income, but positively take away from it, right? Like these music hobbies and these other writing projects and these other
Right.
podcasts I have, like they're just calls, right? But they're fulfilling to me,
Yes.
right? They're fulfilling to me, and they're important to me. So for many years, I did have business goals like, okay, I got to get this many members and I got to get these systems in place and I got to be able to like reliably and predictably produce this much income in my life so that I can not do this stuff all the time, right?
Mhm.
So that I can go do the stuff that I find, just inherently more fun and enjoyable, and all some of the other stuff that you mentioned. So yeah, no big business goal right now, but I did have that for many years where that kind of took the prime
Mhm.
spot of getting those systems in place. And then, I'm a swallow the biggest frog first type of guy, right? If there's a priority
Uh,
goal, this is where I'm focused in the morning, because I'm also a morning person. That's when I tend to have my best energy and focus, and a lot of it does come down to writing. So yeah, no, we just grind away
mhm.
at the morning. So I kind of segment my day of, okay, the biggest, most important thing, not the most urgent. It's different. Things are urgent. I got a lot of urgency with my email inbox right now. It's not important. It's not the most important thing, right? So that waits. The most important thing gets my best attention every single day for a
Mhm.
considerable amount of time, and then it just kind of like falls down the priority or importance
Mhm.
from there is how I typically go about it. Mhm.
What's your writing process like? Do you do a specific thing to kind of get yourself in that creative mindset, or is it pretty much like, all right, this is my writing time, and just start hammering away?
Yeah, so I do have a bit of a process. Coffee is part of it.
There we go.
No, first is good writing is imitation, and this is something I got from both Stephen King's advice and William Zinsser. He's got an excellent book on writing well, where he said before he ever wrote anything, he would always read a few paragraphs of E.B. White, right? So he'd never just write sort of dry. He would always stir his imagination with something that he wanted to imitate, not plagiarize, obviously, but be inspired by. He wanted to get a certain tone in his ear or a certain rhythm in his ear. Uh, that's phenomenal advice. I try and do that. So before I ever write anything, whatever I'm writing, I try to read at least a little bit. It doesn't have to be a ton of something that I think would be inspiring that I want to imitate in that context, right? And that varies from context to context, right? If I'm writing a sales letter, that's going to be a completely different type of thing that I'll read than if I'm writing a philosophy article or something like that. You see what I mean, right?
Right.
Or if I want to write something humorous, I'm going to go read a couple pages of Mark Twain or Ring Lardner or something like that.
Mhm.
So always that first. Then yeah, my daily sort of writing warm up is, and this is related to my business, is I'm an email marketer, so I do a lot of
Mhm.
email marketing. So that to me is my writing warm up pretty much every day, because that's great because it checks two boxes, gets the juices flowing, and does like the minimum effective dose promotion I need for my business type of thing, right? Then then I head into whatever the primary project is after that. So a little bit of reading, a little bit of writing warm up, which is almost always my email blast, and then right to my primary assignment.
It's interesting. I'm reading Stephen King's On Writing book right now.
Yeah, it's a good one.
It is fascinating. I talked about it with Dan John a couple of weeks ago when we were chatting on the podcast, too. And that point of just reading a little bit of how you want to be inspired at that moment is such a huge thing, to do. Of like, I started doing that with Walt Whitman, like just because for some reason, just the way that he writes in poetry form and the way that he writes, I'm like, okay, this is an eloquent way of putting things together. So it's like, there's a warm up kind of practice that you can do, for anything. We think of that like in terms of like fitness and stuff, but for business, for writing, I think it's so interesting that it can all connect together.
And you're right. And there's this idea of osmosis. So King goes further than that, right? I mean, his whole book could be summarized by a line that he has in the book that read a lot, write a lot, right? So you want to be a better writer, read a lot and write a lot. So I want to emphasize that. It's like, even though I do a little bit of reading every time before I write, I also do a lot of reading in general. And I think that's important. You need the sort of raw materials to work with, and you will learn by osmosis and just sort of steeping yourself in a particular environment. And again, that carries right over from what I always kind of knew growing up as a musician. My guitar instructor would always say, like, look, if you want to sound like Angus Young or whoever, you better be listening to them all the time. You got to try and play them too, but like they need to be surrounding you, right? Because you're just going to absorb it. That their styles, their nuances, just by pure osmosis, right? Even if you're not trying to, if you're just surrounded by it, you will absorb it. I'm going to say same thing with writing, right? If you're not reading and reading a lot, then I'm not surprised that you have a time writing, right? Yes. But if you are reading and reading a lot, you're going to have all sorts of raw material in terms of not just matter of stuff to write about. So hopefully the wheels will be turning on ideas, but also manner in terms of tones, styles, cadences, rhythms, all that sort of thing.
Right. There's a great quote by Beethoven called "Don't just practice your art, but force your way into its secrets." It's like, it's such a great line. It's kind of what you're saying, right there, Pat, on it. If you really want to go down this path, it's like, don't just practice it. Don't just do that. It's like, force your way into the other things. Like if you're reading or, and you're doing that for writing, like you can look at those different nuances of coming in. So kind of like force your way into it. Stephen King is I didn't realize the genius that he was behind writing. I'm a Misery fan. I love his work that he does, but the practice that he does of, he reads all the time, he's writing all the time. And it really is just a matter of kind of sometimes putting those reps in at the same time too, and just doing that. And you just never know in the end. And the one thing he said too about that, which I thought was interesting, is like, don't ask a writer where his ideas come from. He's like, we have no idea where they come from. It's
the muse, as Stephen Pressfield talks about, right? The muse, like the muse will show up once you've done your part, right? Once you've done the work and you start acting like a professional, then the muse will show up. Sometimes the muse won't show up, but the muse is only going to show up if you've done your part, right? Consistently.
Yeah. Do you read a bunch of different things at one time, or do you like have a book that you kind of, dive into, at once and then go to the next one?
So the answer is yes. I'm always kind of reading very broadly, but if I have a project, especially a book or research project, I'll also be reading very deeply in one area, sort of primarily, if that makes sense, right? Okay. So like a lot of my reading focus might just be on one book or one research area, but always just because I'm trying to be a good generalist, there's always kind of other stuff surrounding it, even if it doesn't get as much of my time.
Do you go back to a lot of things you've read before? Like, I know you've been huge in philosophy. I had Dr. James Madden on a while ago and got to chat with him. And I know you guys have done Philosophy for the People, which is phenomenal. If you want to understand really the ancient work of philosophy, I think it's, you guys have such a phenomenal program.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah. So is there some specific ones that you seem like you go back to all the time?
Oh yeah. I mean, the great philosophical works, I think it's necessary. I mean, there's a philosopher I always liked very much named Mortimer Adler, and he's actually the guy who kind of pioneered the Great Books program. And he would say specifically about Aristotle's Ethics, this is always his advice. For whatever reason, this advice always stuck with me because it seemed arbitrary, but then it's one of those things you realize is true after you follow it. He said you have to read Aristotle's Ethics at least 12 times. You won't get it unless you read it at least 12 times, and it can't be 12 times in the same year. It's got to be like 12 times over 12 years. Type of advice. And that's right.
Long game.
Yeah, but that's right with the truly great works, right? They just have so many layers of depth and discovery and meaning and significance that it'd be like profoundly naive and arrogant to think you could just give it like one read and you're good. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, all the great works. I mean, Plato's Republic, his dialogues, Aristotle's works, especially the Ethics, Boethius, Augustine, all those guys. Any of the great works of philosophy are things I think you have to return to again and again and again, and importantly over different phases of your life too.
You know, one of the most interesting things I realized from rereading something, and I think it kind of comes back to why you read it 12 different times, is because you're going to go through different things in your life. You know, that's kind of like the marriage to that to fitness is, if you do deadlifts, which is a phenomenal generalist, minimalist program, is going to give you a lot. Well, if you do that for 10 years, you're going to go through different phases where you're going to recognize and learn different things. And I saw that from one of my favorite books was Way of a Peaceful Warrior by Dan Millman. And the first time I read it, I was 20 years old, you know, much different. And the last time I reread it, there was a piece in that where one of the guys who owned a restaurant in that book, and the whole book is really kind of about, you know, detachment, about being in the present. It's a phenomenal story. But the guy's restaurant burned down, and he let out, when he saw this, he just let out this huge bellow of just grief and anger, like every just different emotion came out in once. And then as soon as that was done, he just kind of let it all go and he just moved off from there. And it was such an interesting way of like, okay, you can feel all of the emotions, but you don't have to let it dwell on you for so long. And just from going through some stuff over the last couple of years with, you know, a lot of changes, you know, in life and in business and stuff, I didn't recognize that first off. So I think it's so important to go back and see these things because, as you said, reading it 12 times, it's not just, you know, the words are going to change a lot just based on your experience.
Yeah, it's so true. And, you know, there's a number of works in philosophy and theology too, that it's actually been somewhat like advised that like, you shouldn't even read this until you're like 50 years old, if you get to 50, right? Because you're just not going to get it, right? You're just not going to have that sort of worldly life experience that this is going to make the impact it needs to on you.
Right.
So I don't know if I would say that you shouldn't read something until you're a certain age, but minimally, like if you did read it before, you should at least read it again when you're at that age, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, it's like, what's the line of like the Tao Te Ching, right? It takes 20 minutes to read and takes 20 years to understand.
Yeah. Which is it got right over there, right? That's one that I've popped open many, many times throughout the years.
That's funny. Is there any kind of modern thinkers or modern philosophers that you have read that you really think are profound and really have a very similar approach to a lot of the greats from the ancient times?
Yeah, I mean, there's modern philosophy is an interesting beast, right? Because it's sort of hyper specialized in a way that a lot of the ancient thinkers weren't. A lot of these different guys, you know, from Plato even all the way up to like Leibniz, like these guys were really kind of generalists. They were system builders, right? They were really like systematic in trying to like soup to nuts make sense of reality. Whereas a lot of modern philosophy is it's hyper specialized, right? Where it's like, okay, here's like one like problem within a problem within a problem within a problem in epistemology or something like that, and I'm gonna dedicate 50 years to trying to like work this thing out. I'm like, that's useful, don't get me wrong, but it's that's just sort of the nature of a lot of modern philosophical research and writings and stuff like that. But there are still great system builders, and in fact, you'll find this in a lot of philosophy of religion. That's a branch of philosophy, and sometimes people hear that and they get confused if they're not familiar. The philosophy of religion is not just religious people, right? Philosophy of religion has people, many different paradigms, people who believe in God, people who don't believe in God, people who are agnostic. But the reason they engage in philosophy of religion is because it kind of demands you to be a system builder, because it tries to establish a worldview or paradigm to make sense of reality as a whole, right? So in that sense, just that branch of philosophy has always been extremely interesting to me. And so I read a lot of modern philosophers of religion because they're speaking to, I think, the most important questions that a lot of the ancient philosophers spoke to as well. They tend to be more system builders, and it forces you to be a great generalist, because to be a system builder, you have to kind of consider the different branches of philosophy and how they all sort of link up and integrate, whether it's metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, logic, all of it, right? So yeah, I tend to focus, and this is where I also do a lot of my own writing stuff is in philosophy of religion, because it has to deal with worldview construction and worldview comparison, system building, and stuff like that. So yeah, there's tons of thinkers I love there. I mean, people probably won't recognize their name because they're kind of just obscure academics. So thinkers like, John Haldane and Bernard Lonergan and Eleanor Stump and Father Doris Clark, and yeah, there's a lot of them. But I think the thing I would say is that it tends to be philosophers are either in metaphysics or philosophy of religion that are most interesting to me for those reasons.
Yeah. It's interesting you said a lot of modern philosophy now, it's almost like they're going into hyper specialization, because we've seen that so much in the medical field. It's like where there's no general doctors, it seems, anymore. Like everybody goes into, you find something that you're really interested in and you go hyper specialized from there. Which I think there's a lot of positives to that, right? I mean, if you have a heart issue, you go to a specific heart doctor, but I wonder if it's like you said, it's like the system of it, of building that foundation of being good at a bunch of things before you focus on being great at another thing. It seems like it's spilled right over into the philosophy world, just like anything.
And not only that, but as Aristotle tells us, a small error in the beginning can be multiplied 1,000 times downstream, right? So yeah, if you don't try and start out with like a good paradigm and a good system, and you start hyper specializing in the wrong direction, I mean, you're just going to compound the issues, right? And without getting into too many specifics, I think this is exactly what you see in so much of the hyper specialist modern philosophy. It's like people who are trying to solve problems that shouldn't have been problems at all if you would have just tried to figure out the right starting point, right?
Right.
So they got their whole kind of background assumptions and starting points wrong, and then they just compound problems and compound problems. So it's just a very kind of futile and almost funny little thing. But that's not to discount that hyperspecialization has its purposes and its advantages. It's just the way philosophy is done today is, like you said, like medicine. It's got its subdivisions within subdivisions, and people will just really hyperspecialize and focus on just one particular thing that they actually aren't good philosophical generalists, right? And so they can be, very knowledgeable in one particular area of philosophy, but completely ignorant in another.
It's always fascinating to me on that, and relating it back into like strength and fitness. It's like if system building and building a foundation of stuff like that, like we know it's a phenomenal approach. It is not a sexy marketing slogan out there to build a foundation over the next 2 years of doing these 3 exercises, and so on and so forth, or read just these books right here. It's because you want to get into that. So I just wonder if it's just has more to do with the culture than we even actually say about it. And it's like, my focus is always like, if we can help as many people as possible build that foundation on it, we're just going to be better as a whole if you take that individual responsibility. So I'm just wondering if the hyper specialization is just moving us in a direction where, there are some positives, but we are forgetting that there's some gaping holes in the negatives that could be building up over a long period of time.
Yeah, it causes people to lose focus and priority, right? It's like they look at like what some coach is doing as a hyper specialist for some like elite athlete, and it's like, dude, you can't even squat properly. Why are you trying to mimic this? Right?
Yes.
So, and I think that's what you're getting at, right? Is that the kind of the hyper specialization can attract people, or maybe better distract people from the stuff that they should be focusing on, the fundamentals and the system building, that maybe at some point down the line, those aspects of specialization might make sense, but they don't make sense right now. Right now, you should be doing the basics. You should be doing the fundamentals. This is what you need. So I think that's a concern. And I think you see it in philosophy too. Sometimes people will be like diving into some highly specialized subject and trying to make a point. It's like, man, you haven't even learned basic categorical logic, right? It's just,
right.
You need to back way up.
Right. It's such an interesting system. There's an experience I had a long time ago with a young kid who came in. He was a baseball player, and I worked with a lot of young baseball players for a while. And his dad came in and wanted him to be the greatest third baseman of all time. And I was, big into FMS. I was doing assessments with him and stuff. And his dad brings me in Evan Longoria, who was on the Tampa Bay Devil Rays at the time, one of the best third basemen in the game, and brings in his workout. And he's like, can you do this with him? Because we want him to be the best third baseman.
That's it, man.
And I was like, your son can't touch his toes. It's like, and it was one of those just moments when you're just like, you remember certain things over your time of doing this for so long. And that just sticks so quickly in my head. I remember exactly where I was this time. It's like, okay, there's a big disconnect between what we think brings us to an elite level and what is actually practical, to do from
that. That is the perfect example.
Yeah, it is.
Of the point I think we're trying to make, right?
It is. Yeah. Well, so it's, kind of going, you're working in jiu-jitsu right now, of just going back in, and that's tapping into kind of, you said, going back into some white belt type feel for you.
Yep.
So going back to some foundations for strength training is probably a perfect marriage with that, because that's probably taking more of that creative energy in your training than maybe what you need from the other side.
And I hope that I'm just a little bit wiser now than I guess I was in the past, where, I just talk with Ryan, like, hey man, let's just keep drilling the basics, right? Because I know that this is what matters, like basic passes, basic sweeps, right? I don't need to, I don't need to get into all that fancy stuff, right? And Ryan gets it. He's a great coach. So that's exactly what we do. But like, I appreciate that now. If I were 15, 16, I wouldn't have appreciated that. I would have been like, I saw this guy doing something on YouTube that was crazy. Teach me that. You know what I mean? And that would have been that, but that would have been foolish. Now I see that. So now I actually appreciate and get excited about the basics, and hopefully like getting to be able to do the basics at a PhD level at some point. Whereas, like 15-year-old Pat, 16-year-old Pat, like I would have been like seeing what the Googling what the hyper specialist is doing on YouTube and like trying to bring that to my coach. Like, teach me this thing, right?
Yeah, come on. That's. Do you still do coaching? I know you still have. Do you do individual coaching, or you do more of like group type work? Or?
All online, yeah. So still have online coaching as part of the offering over at the Pat Flynn Enterprise. Yeah, sure. Yeah. And it comes in rounds. Usually we'll just do like, I don't know, maybe between 1 to 3 times per year. We'll open up the opportunity for online coaching slots, stuff like that.
Okay. Is it mostly general population that you do? Or are you working with specific groups?
Yeah, mostly gen pop, mostly kettlebell enthusiasts still.
Do you see this type of like thought process even in adults that you work with? Like we said, like the 15, 16-year-old who's seeing the cool stuff on YouTube, like we can understand that. But do you see that's even in the like adults that you work with as well? And you kind of have to steer them in this direction?
Well, not as much anymore, like, because as I'm sure you know, as anybody who's been in the coaching game for a while, it's not, one of the mistakes I made early on was thinking that I can and should work with everybody, right? And that's not true. Not everybody is a good fit for personal fitness coaching, and not everybody certainly is going to be a good fit for you or with you. And so, over the years, this is a lesson that I've learned and come to appreciate now. So not anybody can even really apply for coaching. First off, the only people that can even apply for coaching are people who are on my email list and are active subscribers. So it's already going to be people who have had their sort of expectations appropriately set in a way. And then there's a sort of additional screening process from there of a call and just to make sure that the expectations are properly set. Because it's a mistake, right? If you start working with somebody and they have these unrealistic or inappropriate expectations, well, now you have to do all this other work of trying to get them back to reality before you can start coaching. And that's an unnecessary adjustment process if it can even be done. So I do what I can just to avoid all of that. I just very very upfront. I try to be very clear that the people who can apply to work with me are people who've at least kind of been in my world for a while, following me and already know what I'm about. And then we're going to still have an additional screening process before just anybody is accepted as a coaching process. I'm into the coaching relationship, I should say. And I think that's better for everybody, because then you get to the types of relationships where it's almost guaranteed that it's going to be of benefit for both parties involved.
Nice.
Yeah.
Is there a specific kind of questioning process that you go through for people, when you like first get into like a new prospect that comes in, or do you keep it pretty general?
No, I've got kind of ways of testing expectations of
Mhm.
different thought experiments. Like, one of them is pretty classic thought experiment, but I think it works. Goal based thought experiment. In fact, one of my business mentors you asked me this question one time. I thought it was a really cool way of phrasing it that I've adopted it for fitness, where I say to somebody, "Hey, imagine that we're 3 months into the future. We've been working together for those 3 months, and we're looking back over that time. Describe to me what would have had to happen over those 3 months for you to consider our time together a success." And then when they start describing that, that's part of the screening process for me to see where their expectations are at. Also kind of like get some real kind of tangible detail on their goals as well, where it's not just like, oh, I want to lose weight or something like that. No, really describe in detail what would have had to have happened over those 3 months for you to say that was worth it. That was something I'm really glad I did.
It's a great question. It dives deeper into that just initial layer that we all like to just talk about, and just goes just one layer, underneath when you start to actually get a feeling and an emotion behind the goal as well.
Well, that's it. There's and this is, I guess, part of the marketing aspect of it too, is it hopefully should put somebody in an excited mindset, because now they're visualizing
Yes.
that success, right? And that's yeah. There's that element of it as well.
Yeah. Has your process of coaching changed that much since you first kind of got into it? Is like, if there have been like some big things that like have made some adjustments in how you coach people now versus maybe how you coach people when you first were initially getting started?
Well, that's the biggest thing now,
Mhm.
is doing more to set expectations from the start and having a sort of filter or screening process. In terms of like, yeah, I think I've gotten smarter and more refined with my programming and all
Mhm.
that too. But the biggest change from when I first started, where I want to work with everybody in the world, right,
Mhm.
to now, is that here's what I'm about. Here's what I can do. Here's what I can't do. Right. Here's just what's out of Pat Flynn's realm of expertise. Right. So being very clear about that, making sure that people have kind of been steeped in my world before they can even apply for coaching, and then having that additional,
Mhm.
um, yeah, call it a screening process before we actually begin the coaching process.
Right.
To me, is a complete game changer, right? It's a complete game changer. And now you kind of fight against yourself a little bit to see it that way, because of course the general impulse, especially if you're like a young coach, is like, I want to work with everybody, not just because I feel like it can save the entire world, but also I want all the money, right?
Exactly.
I want
Yes.
all the income, and yeah, and I want
Mhm.
to say that that's a mistake, right? Because if you spread yourself too thin and you start getting a lot of clients that aren't a good fit, and it's stressful, and then they're unhappy, and then that doesn't help you, and it doesn't help your business at all, right?
Yeah.
So restrain yourself, get a sort of expectations building and screening process in place, and make sure that itself is systematized.
Mhm.
That's the biggest change, and has been the biggest game changer in my
Yeah.
coaching.
Yeah. I think there's some merit to, if you are a young coach, you're just getting into it, having that mindset for a little bit of time can kind of feed you in the right direction at the same time, though, right? It's like, if you like, it is like when you're a young coach, and like, whoever wants to pay me money, I will train, I will do whatever I can, for it. And you almost kind of like just getting your reps in at that time,
You got to learn
to,
the hard way. Some lessons you got to learn the hard way. I
oh yeah,
agree, right? So like, yeah, I can say I've learned this now, but why did I? Because I learned the hard way, right? And
exactly.
it wasn't even just me in my own business that learned the hard way, but even when I was in college, I was coaching at different gyms like the YMCA,
Mhm.
and like, you don't really get to select who you work with at the Y. They just, or at least when I was there many years ago, they just, hey, you're working with this person, have
Yeah.
at it, right? It's like, that'll teach you a lot of stuff, man, of how to deal with different scenarios, and put you in, yeah, just
Mhm.
bad
Yeah.
fits, and yeah,
Yeah.
no matter what, you always learn something from it, right?
It's funny because, like, when I was first in this business, over a decade plus ago, it's like I was the same as many young kids. Like, I wanted to work with athletes. I loved working with athletes and go like deep in it. And I worked with my fair share of athletes, and it was a blast doing it. Worked with a lot of hockey teams, worked with some professionals in track and field. But the general population people actually was the most fulfilling that I found early on in coaching. It's like,
Mhm.
because it was really such a lesson for life that they were trying to build up, and like they wanted to kind of go into the details more and know about how this is going to carry over into their life. And they came back and they were, feeling good. I've told this story before of this woman, Helen, who was over 90 years old when I first started working with her. And she had a goal of opening up a peanut butter jar, like that was her only goal, because she liked to
Amazing.
have an English muffin with peanut butter and watch the news in the morning. That was
Who
like her
doesn't?
joy
Yeah.
of life, right? 3 weeks into training with her, she came in, she actually put a peanut butter jar down on my desk and opened it in front of me.
That's
And
amazing. That's an
dude,
amazing
the
story.
look on her face was like she just won the Super Bowl, like pulling up the Lombardi trophy, just
Mhm.
like they did, the other day. And it's, I'm like, so, but if you don't open yourself up, I think, to that too, you don't know who like gives you that most joy and fulfillment in there, because
Yeah.
athletes might be a beautiful thing, but also athletes come with their own, kind of baggage as well. It's like, it's very kind of one-dimensional, and sometimes too, like you might love working with general population, or you like love working with powerlifting, whatever it is from there. So kind of keeping yourself almost open, probably the same like with reading or writing, like write about a bunch of stuff or read a bunch of things, see what kind of taps into you first. And that's, kind of going back to the beginning of our conversation, like be good at a little bit of everything. And then
Mhm.
you kind of find out what you really might be great at.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point, and it also reminds you that you are not your client, right?
Yes.
I remember as a young coach, like it just didn't make sense to me that somebody would want to train for anything aside from a huge deadlift and six-pack abs, right? Like
Yes.
you're telling me you want to be able to crawl around with your grandkids? That doesn't make sense, right? But now, as a father myself, not yet a grandfather, right?
All right.
That makes a ton of sense, right? But it was something I just didn't appreciate as a
Mhm.
younger coach. And like, certainly I wouldn't have like understood the peanut butter thing, but the lesson I had to learn is I'm not necessarily my client, right?
Yes.
And you don't have to have the same goals as your client to still be a good fit for your client, to be able to serve your client, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, your peanut butter example just reminded me of that. That is something that has changed as well, as I've come to have a much broader appreciation
Mhm.
of the different reasons, often very good reasons, that people even want to pursue fitness in the first place.
Love it. Love it. Pat, man, it's always good talking to you. This is
Oh
great.
man, it's a
Yeah,
joy.
this
Mhm.
time just absolutely flies by. So I appreciate you taking the time, and this was just a blast. So we're gonna have to do it again soon. Yeah. So
Anytime, anytime, brother. Mhm.
yeah, I know you got a lot going on from there. What's the best place that we can direct listeners into finding out more about you, consuming your content?
Yes. So if your listeners are podcast listeners, which I suspect that they are, then you can find my more fitness-based podcast over at the Pat Flynn Show, the humbly and originally named the Pat Flynn Show. And Dan John's on there once a week, so they'll probably dig that.
Yeah.
You mentioned my other podcast, the Offshoot podcast, that is, I guess, still somewhat new, that I co-host with Jim Madden, who is on your show, and that's called Philosophy for the People. That one is not yet on iTunes. It's just really on YouTube at this point. People are asking me to get it on iTunes, and it's a priority thing. Like, it's
Yep.
maybe someday, but for now it's on YouTube. So if people want the more philosophical stuff, they want to just check that out. And then my webpage, chroniclesofstrength.com.
Awesome. Yeah, the Q&As that you and Jim do on that, I think, are phenomenal, from there.
Oh, thank
Yeah,
you.
I really love that. So if anybody's interested in philosophy and going deeper into it, you guys go into kind of the philosophy 101 stuff, as well as going deep into it at the same time, depending on the questions, which that's for any time I want to drive like into that world from there, you guys are the go-tos on that. So listeners, go check them out.
Thank you, Mike. Means a lot.
Pat, you're the best. Appreciate it. Listeners, thank you so much for connecting. If you want to check out more of Pat's stuff, you know where to do so, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye, guys.